Hello and welcome to Food for You and the Planet, a fresh new podcast that explores healthy and environmentally sustainable food solutions. This podcast is brought to you by Healthy Planet Online Farmers Market. I'm Dr. Rosemary Ostfeld and I'm your host. Together, we'll hear from leaders in environmental science, agriculture, medicine, nutrition, entrepreneurship, and more. Be sure to hit the subscribe button to hear all the latest in healthy and sustainable food with food for you and the planet. Today's episode features Evrett Lunquist, Director of Certification at Demeter USA, part of the Biodynamic Demeter Alliance. Born and raised in Minnesota, Evrett Lunquist discovered his love of agriculture in college. He went on to complete a self-designed bachelor's degree from the University of Minnesota in Sustainable Food and Agriculture Systems, where he studied food science, agronomy, and infrastructures and cultural dynamics involved with the field-to-table journey of food. He first encountered biodynamics in 1992 while studying a Wisconsin produce farm inspired by Camphill Communities. He ended up returning to that farm and lived there for 2 years and followed his biodynamic interest with an intensive 2-week training at Michael Field's Agricultural Institute. Then in 1996, Evrett Lunquist founded with his wife and kids a diverse biodynamic produce farm integrated with livestock in southeast Nebraska. He has made all the biodynamic preparations over the years with the guidance of many individuals at biodynamic conferences and personal interactions. Expanding the scope of his involvement with biodynamics, Evrett began inspecting farms and processors for Demeter USA in 2001. Evrett also inspected for numerous organic certifiers, has extensive inspection training from the International Organic Inspectors Association, and has worked as a certification reviewer for several certification agencies. Evrett comes to Demeter USA with a passion for farming, high-quality food and its preparation, and educating others about organic and biodynamic practices. Thank you for being here today.
Glad to be here. Thanks for having me.
What is Demeter USA? And what type of work does it do?
So Demeter USA, also known as Demeter Association, is the Biodynamic Certifier of agriculture, food products, food processing, compost making, apiary for bees, as well as textiles. So all those can be certified biodynamic, and we do the whole process from start to finish. And so that certification work involves, going on site to farms and processors and verifying that the production and the processing that's done meets the standards for biodynamic agriculture and food processing.
So what is the Biodynamic Demeter Alliance, more as like a global organization? And what types of organization does it encompass?
Mm-hmm. So the Biodynamic Demeter Alliance is a fairly young organization. It was founded a little over 2 years ago, and the goal was actually to bring two of the main major organizations in the United States together in a collaborative way, as well as just some good communication and cooperation between the Biodynamic Association and the Demeter Association. Demeter being the certifier and the Biodynamic Association being the kind of the main educational and research and publication organization around biodynamics in the United States. There's another organization involved that does address the global picture of biodynamics, because it's not just a movement in the U.S. It is actually a global. It's on every continent except maybe not Antarctica. I can't quite verify that. But the Biodynamic Federation, Demeter International, is the umbrella organization that all of these certifiers and biodynamic associations around the world can come under and collaborate globally.
So I shared a little bit about your bio, but I'd love to hear more about what really sparked your interest in biodynamic agriculture and maybe some of the core things that really resonate with you and why you like to pursue its practices.
So before I was aware of biodynamics, I was sitting in my agronomy class at the University of Minnesota, learning about how to fertilize and hormones and enzymes and activity in plants and seeds and germinations, and learning how to identify plants and weeds and that sort of thing. Um, and I just had this kind of nagging that something was missing, but I didn't really know what it was. And then about the same time that I encountered biodynamic for the first time, I was also taking an English class. Um, and we were talking about active and passive sentences, like different structures of how to do sentences. And so I realized in my agronomy class that um, I was learning about plants as in passive sentences. So plants are made of nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus, and the action is basically not even given to the plant. So it's almost like the plants aren't alive. Um, and then it was my English class. I realized, well, if I'm going to make that an active sentence, I would say plants take nitrogen, potassium, and phosphorus and turn it into their cell structures or their bodies, or produce the grains. So at that point, then now you're giving the action to the actor. Plants are suddenly now recognized as being alive, and that was like the missing piece for me. And that's really the crux of where biodynamics kind of launches or starts, is it's recognizing that all things are alive. um, and then how do you work with those living things? It's not something that we necessarily are experts at in terms of teaching about agronomy. Yes, of course, plants are alive, but we don't really recognize that entirely. Like, what does a plant like? What does the living plant need in order for it to be healthy? We just look at fertility, material things. But as the plant is a living thing, like what does it need? Or an animal as a living thing, what does it need beyond just the physical nutrition? There's a bigger picture involved.
So a lot of these ideas came out of the work of Rudolf Steiner. So could you tell me a little bit about the history of biodynamic agriculture and its founder, Rudolf Steiner?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, Rudolf Steiner had quite the breadth of work that he was associated with. When he was 21 years old, he was tasked with the work of editing Goethe's scientific works. And I think, well, wow, that's quite the task for a 21-year-old. So, for one, they're saying like something's going on with this person, that people are willing to entrust that type of a task with this individual. And so he had, as a youth, he also then had experience with some of what you might call peasants in his area. So much more kind of a grounded type of individual, that not necessarily educated at universities, but still having a very real connection with agriculture. And then he also went on to found the anthroposophical movement, which, if you anthro and posophy, so the study of being human, essentially, or the wisdom of being human, and and that is really the foundation of biodynamics, like where the kind of the worldview comes from that biodynamics is founded on. But anthroposophy also launched a number of other activities in the world. So, Waldorf education, in terms of how to educate children and recognizing that teaching, the idea of teaching young children calculus or algebra, complex mathematical concepts when they're in first or second grade, it's not really going to resonate with the child. You might, if you want to teach a child how to recognize even and odd type numbers, then maybe a good way to do that, since the child is very animated and active and wants to mimic what they see, then maybe you teach the child how to stomp. And so it's like, 1, 2, 3, 4, each way is even and odd. And so it involves the actions of the child as well as the concept. So it's just recognizing the needs of the child and how they learn and where they are in their development. So there's Waldorf education. There's also Camphill Communities that developed out of this impulse of recognizing the abilities of all human beings, not just, so some people might have certain disabilities that are more pronounced. And so working with those individuals, instead of focusing on the disability, focusing on the ability that they have, and then living with them in community. And my time living in this Camphill inspired community made me aware that everybody has disabilities. Some people are just more apt or better at concealing them. And so just, recognizing that in humanity, I think, was an important thing for me. So there's lots of different things that Rudolf Steiner kind of had his hands in. And it was kind of not until much later in his life that he was actually kind of commandeered almost to give the lectures on biodynamic agriculture. He was not a farmer by training per se, but he had the capacity to have an insight into how things are, and that's kind of regardless of whether or not you're trained as a farmer. Just recognizing what is a plant, the living aspects of a plant, and having that ability then to perceive those types of things. That's really kind of the foundation of the work. But he gave these lectures in 1924. There was a series of 8 lectures, and they were all given to farmers. And then out of those lectures, there's an experiment circle that formed around his indications. And then the purpose of that circle was to verify what he said was actually going to work. And he was adamant that people not just believe it because he said it.
So what were some of his core beliefs, and what were some of the topics of these lectures and then the experiments that went along with them?
Mm-hmm. So I would like to kind of point out that maybe not so much beliefs, but rather observations of reality. Some people talk about Steiner's worldview, like how things are seen in the world. But in terms of a belief, to me, that has more of a almost a religious connotation to it. And that's very much not what biodynamics is about. Another name for anthroposophy is spiritual science, which some people might see as an oxymoron. How do you put those two things together? But you have the scientific method, and you have spiritual activity, and putting those two things together are not incompatible. But another thing that I'd want to point out is the distinction for Steiner that spiritual is different than religious. Spiritual is the reality, religious is, say, like a person's approach to recognizing the spiritual. And so you have religious practices, but in Steiner's view, there's not spiritual practices in the sense of like, are you a Christian uh, 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 or Muslim or atheist or those types of things? Spiritual is more to do with kind of explaining life. Like life is spiritual in Steiner's view. You can't explain life without there being a spiritual aspect. Um, and so one of the things I like to point out is that in in chemical reactions, for example, like you could take vinegar and baking soda and put those two things together. We've probably seen that where you have all the bubbling and the fizzing, but at the end of the reaction, you have stability. You know, it basically reacts and then it's done. And so trying to explain life simply with a chemical reaction, that's, you know, the vinegar and baking soda reacts, it's done, it's over. And yet, you and I are here talking with each other, having a conversation. We're both alive, um, and that's kind of self apparent. But we are defying what would happen with chemical reactions. So there's something in us that's alive that is going on and continuing and having these thoughts, having these conversations, and that would be where Steiner defines things as spiritual. You know, like you're not talking about a chemical reaction, you're talking about something living. One of the things when I was studying in agronomy was like how GMOs are made, like genetically modified organisms. And it's not that we're taking a little bit of iron and nitrogen and phosphorus and putting it in a test tube and putting some electrical shock therapy in there and creating something that's living. Uh, GMOs are always going back to some living material, you know, some cells that are being modified and then cultured and grown into new plants. So there's something, even with the genetic engineering, recognizing that plants are alive. You know, nobody to date has ever created life out of inanimate objects or chemistry. Um, so that's to me like where my interest sparked with biodynamics. It's like, okay, you know, like we're always going back to life. So what is that life? What is that spark? What is that? Some people call it magical, but Steiner calls it spiritual.
I really like that. I think that's really fascinating. So when he was focusing on the spiritual side of nature, how did he factor those ideas into some of the fundamental teachings of biodynamics?
Well, in terms of the practicalities, it's you know recognizing that with agriculture you're working with something that's alive, and if you it's not a new concept, but it's a kind of a fundamental concept in biodynamics of recognizing that the earth is alive. Um, you know, you could, you know, as an organism, like we think of human beings as an organism, or a cow as an organism, or a microbial cell as an organism. But what if we expand it to the earth as an organism? And now you start thinking, like, well, human beings, are we the mitochondria, or are we, you know, are we the antibodies, or are we the virus? You know, it's like you want to try and figure out like what part people and different aspects of the living earth exist. But so the fundamentals of or the principles that Steiner identified was, you know, biological diversity on the farm. You need to have you essentially you want to try and create an organism for your farm. Um, and interestingly, the origins of organic agriculture started from farm organism that Steiner talked about when he was giving the lectures. And so organism then became organic in terms of a new method of agriculture. So there's some interesting interplay where, you know, Steiner's ideas even influenced, say, like J.I. Rodale, you know, and in terms of Ehrenfried Pfeiffer was one of the people that brought biodynamics to the United States back in the 1940s, and then J.I.O. Rodale and he were colleagues and talked back and forth, and so then this term got coined organic out of those interchanges. But you want to have your farm as a kind of a mini organism unto itself. And really, for an organism to be healthy, it needs to have some integrity to itself, some sustainability to itself. You know, obviously, an animal is going to eat to be healthy, but you don't necessarily want to be having living with an IV, for example. That'd be a hospital situation. You're in triage. You're trying to support the life, but it's not a very good example in terms of how to have a healthy organism. You know, you want to have a healthy, you know, human body, a healthy farm organism, a healthy earth. Another thing that he identified as a part of that healthy organism is regenerating fertility from within the farm. So you can export all sorts of fertility from elsewhere, you know, essentially pillaging something from somewhere on the earth and bringing it to make your, you know, fabulous soil in one place, but another place of the earth is suffering because of what you're, you know, shipping in. So on-farmer fertility generation is key. Part of that is integrating livestock. Very fundamental principle of biodynamics, that you grow fodder on your farm and then you feed your livestock, you have the manure, you make compost, and then that's the kind of the foundation of your fertility source, as well as growing things like legumes, cover cropping, which is not only done by biodynamic farmers, of course, but it is a fundamental principle. Maintaining and enhancing the soil carbon in your soil. You want to have humus-rich soil for growing these types of food crops in particular, as well as fodder. On-farm solutions. So if you have an insect that's getting out of hand and causing you difficulty, what are the solutions on farm? You know, can you change cultural practices? Can you encourage certain insects? If you have a lot of aphids, maybe you need to be having a pollinator beneficial insect habitat or a pollen source for those ladybugs. And so they can come in and bring balance to your farm. Let's see, use of biodynamic preparations. That's a fundamental requirement for a biodynamic farm. Those were outlined in Steiner's lectures. One thing I would encourage is if you're reading Steiner for the first time, probably read a book that's the person's inspired by Steiner, and then understand kind of where Steiner's coming from, and then read Steiner directly, because Steiner was actually giving these lectures to people that were already familiar with anthroposophy, and so they already understood a little bit about his kind of worldview and perspective, and so there's just an awareness at the lectures. And so if you read the lectures just out of the gate without any kind of familiarity with Steiner, it's going to sound a little strange if you're coming from a kind of a traditional materialistic perspective. But yes, so the biodynamic preparations were presented there. Gentle processing is a requirement for any products. So you're cultivating your soils in a way that they're going to have a lot of vitality, and then you're growing these crops, you're raising these animals, and then the end goal is high vitality soil lots of energy, lots of life forces. And then the plants and the animals are all going to be have this high vitality. And so then when whoever eats the food is then going to have this high vitality, these living foods that are going to be able to nourish the human being, not only from the materialistic, like, proteins and carbohydrates and vitamin side, but also from the living vitality. You're actually consuming life when you eat food, and you can either have a high vitality or you can have a low vitality in terms of the food. And the way that translates into the food itself is like, how long is that apple gonna last on the counter? So you have storability. A high vitality food is going to have a lot of integrity, and it's going to store longer and have better flavor, and support the person and the animal that much better. Interestingly, the last principle that I'll bring up is recently this idea of a healthy farm organism has for a while been focused on the plants and the soil and the livestock, but now it just makes sense that we're expanding this to the people. So social responsibility is coming into the biodynamic standard as well.
And now you mentioned some other people who were involved in the early days of the biodynamic movement that were interested in Rudolf Steiner's ideas. So, who are some of the other key figures that helped sort of expand his observations and share his teachings?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think I'm going to say his first name correctly. It's Ehrenfried Pfeiffer. Was a student under Steiner and brought the impulse to the United States. Interestingly enough, his work somewhat focused on like just everyday things. Like he was working with a municipality in California for like composting garbage. And then finding a way to bring these biodynamic preparations to the composting process to really enhance the process as well as the final product. But then out of that, then there was this creation of the Biodynamic Association. So that was founded, I believe, in 1938. So that's been in the United States for quite a long time. And then, so that was it. The Biodynamic Association has been a very much an early influencer as an organization. Lily Kalisko over in Europe did a bunch of research based on Steiner's indications on how plants grow, and lots of scientific studies that were completed there. Maria Thun also did some research and particularly in the calendar. Like a lot of people associate biodynamic with planting by the lunar phases or planetary things. Not required for certification, but often people do reference a calendar when they're planting. So not unlike the Farmer's Almanac, in terms of planting by the moon or that sort of thing. A little more developed though, because the moon in the biodynamic sense has different capacities depending on which constellation that it passes through. Another influencer was Hugh Courtney, who was trained under Josephine Porter, and now there's an organization called the Josephine Porter Institute, and she brought preparation making to kind of like to a T with in the United States, and then Hugh Courtney trained under her, and then now the Josephine Porter Institute is a retail supplier of preparations. So you can get your biodynamic preparations. You don't have to know how to make them, and you can still benefit from their impact. One of the very first farm to practice biodynamic in the United States, I believe, is Ruth and Dick Zinneker in East Troy, Wisconsin. So they started back in the 40s, I believe, and they've since passed away, but they have the farm is still in the family, and so that I would say that the oldest practicing farm in the U.S. And so they have had lots of people come through there for training, and they do a lot of preparation making that's open to the community there. So that was definitely a early influencer.
So when and where did the biodynamic certification first begin? And when did that start taking place in the United States?
Mhm. Yeah, the lectures were given in 1924, and then the first certifications happened in 1928 in Germany. And so we can fairly say that it's the first agroecological certification in the world. Um, this was the lectures were given in part because farmers identified that that the chemical fertilizers that were being introduced to agriculture at that time were having an effect uh, in a negative way on crops, on livestock. And so the farmers came to Steiner asking, what can we do to improve the health of our soils, improve the health of our plants and our livestock? And so that was the impetus for those lectures. Um, and then, yeah, at that time, it was the certification was done by Demeter International, or no, it's done by a different group. Demeter International formed a little bit later because there was interest in bringing all of these different certification agencies into conversation and collaboration from around the world. And then the Biodynamic Federation actually is a fairly young organization that was just formed in 2020. Um, and the purpose there was to expand the participation from just biodynamic certifiers to include some of like the biodynamic associations or other member organizations from around the world. And so now there's Demeter certifiers as well as Demeter educator or biodynamic educators that are participating in the Biodynamic Federation. In the US, biodynamic certification began in 1985. That was the first certification. So kind of a very similar time to when a lot of organic certifiers were starting to get their getting established in the US.
And so what are some of the ways that biodynamic certification and USDA certified organic are maybe similar or different?
So biodynamic certification starts with NOP organic, so the National Organic Program. So we use that as the base. You have to meet the organic requirements to be Demeter certified. You don't necessarily have to be certified organic. If an operation is not certified organic, then we go through and make sure that you meet the base as like an internal review that we do and part of the inspection. But you can have a standalone Demeter only certification. And in that case, you're meeting the organic requirements, but you're not certified organic. And other similarities. So Demeter is more restrictive in terms of inputs that are allowed. So we don't allow things like Chilean nitrate. It's a natural material, but it's allowed with the organic certification, but it acts in very much like a chemical fertilizer. It's very water soluble, and biodynamic is about enhancing the life of the soil. And Chilean nitrate, brings nitrogen to the water element of the soil, but it doesn't do much in terms of the vitality of the soil. Other things, we have more restrictions in terms of other inputs that are used. So if there's a pest control product that's needed, like pyrethrum or copper sulfate or a number of other ones, then there's an exemption that we require. So in order to use those, you have to try all these things first. So that's similar to organic, but the exemption requires that they're used in a way that prevents damage to the beneficial insects. So, pyrethrum is going to kill bees just the same as cucumber beetles. And so the exemption requires that you use if you're going to use a pyrethrum, you have to use it in a way that protects the bees. So applying it at night, for example, or at dusk when the bees aren't present, or when there's no flowers that the bees are coming to. So we have additional criteria like that. We do have on-farm fertility requirements. That is very unique to Demeter certification. 10% biodiversity reserve is required by Demeter. So of the farm's property, then 10% needs to be devoted to some type of biodiversity reserve, pollinating insects. The criteria is that the area is allowed to flower, so that those flowers are available for the biodiversity. Use of biodynamic preparations, of course, are not required by the NOP, but they are required by Demeter. Those preparations include a horn compost, which I think is, I'm sorry, a horn manure is what it's called, which I think probably should be called horn compost because it's, when you apply it, it's actually more like a compost. It's very much digested. It's not manure at all when it gets applied. We have horn silica, which is another preparation, and then we have 6 compost preparations that are added to the compost piles. And they're all medicinal herbs that have a long history with human medicine. So you have yarrow, chamomile, dandelion, oak bark, stinging nettle, valerian. So all those are treated in a very specific way, and it's like a fermentation process that involves usually burial in the soil, and the resulting medicine, you could almost say, is or a life stimulating material is inserted in very small amounts to the compost pile, and then the influence of those preparations kind of radiate through the whole compost pile. There's a whole microbial population that gets triggered because of these, and they're unique to these biodynamic preparations. There's been some studies, especially the silica and the dandelion preparation, harboring beneficial microbes that are very rare in the world otherwise. Yeah, I think that kind of gives you just a nutshell of kind of some differences. In terms of processing, there's very much a lot of different requirements. Gentle processing is the fundamental requirement for biodynamic products. And in Demeter certification, we recognize that not all products are handled the same. So there's in order to preserve the vitality in the food. So making a wine is very different than making a jam, like a fruit jam, or milk, for example. Like there's pasteurization potential. What's allowed in all these different processings, and so there's actually multiple standards in the processing standard related to the specific food that's being processed.
Are there any other principles and practices required by the biodynamic certification process that you think are important to share or explain?
Mm-hmm. Um, well, one thing that's kind of fundamental to biodynamic is how everything is interconnected and interplays with each other. Um, like on my own farm, for example, we have chickens, and we get eggs, but there's a larger purpose. There's actually like fertilizing the soil. There's insect control. There's weed control. There's weed seed control. So and we also have a few pigs, and they dig up the soil and they're eating. We have bindweed on our farm, and so it's a perennial and reproduces from the roots and spreads out a lot like mint, except it's underground. And so the pigs do a great job with digging that up and eating the roots. So it's and then we have cattle on the farm, and so they're fertilizing the pasture. And then we also use their wintertime like manure for composting, and then that becomes a major part of our potting mix for seedlings that we raise for sale as biodynamic. So there's a lot of interconnections that are made that are really striven for on and with certification. One other aspect that makes us quite different from the NOP is that the NOP, you meet the standard or you don't. And with biodynamic, there's a recognition that every farm is going to start somewhere, and they're going to move towards the ideal biodynamic farm, where you have everything coming from within the farm, and there's this complete cycle, a healthy organism. You don't have to bring in pest control materials. Fertility is generated on farm, But so there's an ideal, and there's the reality of where the farms are starting. And so, yes, there's a minimum that the farms have to meet to get certified. But then there's also an encouragement of progress towards the ideal even after you're certified. So certification is at once verification of a minimum. So as a consumer, you can say, I'm getting a food that has been handled in this way. But then there's also an encouragement and a process that by participating in certification, you're going to be progressing along this path towards this ideal biodynamic farm.
So if a farm wanted to become biodynamic certified, what would the certification process look like? How would they go about becoming certified?
Sure. There's a couple of different processes or a couple different avenues to take. The first question we ask is, are you certified organic? And if you are, then we use those documents to verify kind of the criteria that we're looking for as much. We're going to use what you've already done, essentially. And then we'll verify the additional aspects that need to come. So there'll be an application process, and you either provide your organic documents or we give you more questionnaires for verifying the organic part. And then there's also the questionnaire for the biodynamic side. We will receive that and do an initial review. And if we have any questions or if we need more information, then we follow up with an interview to get the additional details. And then if all looks good, from the paperwork side, we'll send an inspector. And then they go and verify on site that things are as written in the application. And then they'll provide a report back to Demeter, and we do a final review and then make a certification decision based on all of the information that we have. So that's the first year, and then the second year there's a renewal process. and ask for updates and further questions. And then yeah, the inspector comes back out and kind of checks in on things, and then we'll do the certification process again.
How many biodynamic certified farms are there in the US and globally? And if someone wanted to find a biodynamic farm near them, how would they go about doing that? Do you have like a database or some type of record people could explore?
Yeah, the number of farms in the U.S. is still relatively small. It's about 140 certified Demeter farms, and globally, the number is, I believe the number globally is probably closer to 10,000 farms. There's quite a few. Germany alone has several, like I think 25 or 3,500 farms that are certified in just Germany alone. But you know, it kind of makes sense. That's the where the lectures were given originally, and so it's very well known. But we do have a database, so you can go to either our website, which is demeter-usa.org, or you can go directly to the Biodynamic Directory.org, and that's where the listing is of all certified farms, as well as certified processors. And then we also have a category called a trader, which is somebody that's either arranging products to be made and labeled as biodynamic, but they don't actually touch the products themselves. Or some folks out of the country will import products to the U.S. And we have a different review process that goes through, and so those are also listed on the website. And then there is also a international database, so you can actually search worldwide where all the farms and processors are located, and that's on the Demeter.net website.
So you shared that the founding lectures given by Rudolf Steiner on biodynamic agriculture were given in 1924. So that makes this the 100th year globally for biodynamics. So what are some exciting things that are happening this year to celebrate 100 years globally for biodynamic agriculture?
So starting last year, there was a conference in Dornach, Switzerland at the Goetheanum, which is the kind of the headquarters of the Anthroposophical Society. And then they have a section for agriculture that focuses on biodynamic. And so last year there was an agriculture conference that was focused on, you know, like 100 years looking back, you know, like where have we been? And then that was in February. It happens every February. And then this year in February, there was a 100-year kind of celebration of just, you know, the biodynamic lectures, and it was lots of people from all over the world. Over 1,000 people came to attend this conference. And then next year, there's going to be a February conference in Dornach for okay, 100 years looking forward. Like, where are we going from here? And then in the U.S., then there's going to be a celebration that I'll be attending in Oregon, in McMinnville. There's going to be there's a number of certified wineries up there and vineyards, as well as farms, and there's going to be an event then on June 8th, celebrating the 100 years. There's also going to be some events in Pennsylvania and New York, also celebrating that. And then there's the Southeast Biodynamic group that's putting on a conference in Tennessee in the fall, and it's going to be a reenactment of the original lectures. And so that will be quite interesting. And then now going back to June, end of June, there's going to be in Germany, there's going to be a international celebration for the biodynamic lectures. I think it's on June 28th at a farm there in Germany, and that's going to be quite the deal. I believe, the Secretary of Agriculture is going to be one of the keynote speakers. So it gives you a sense of how ingrained biodynamic agriculture is in Germany when the Secretary of Agriculture is showing up.
Are there any other things that you would like to share about biodynamic agriculture or Rudolf Steiner and his work?
I think the fundamental, when it comes down to, like, when I first encountered biodynamics, I thought it was pretty strange. And I think the main thing I would encourage folks to do, like when you first encounter biodynamic or something seems strange, our tendency is to push it away and say that's ridiculous, or just put up the barriers. But what I find is, if I don't understand something in biodynamics, I just let it sit. Don't make a judgment on it. And then lo and behold, something a year later or 2 years or 5 years later comes along. Like, oh, like this little light goes on. It's like, oh, now I can see kind of like where this was coming from. So it's just dispelling disbelief. And it's not saying that you have to believe it. It's just, don't write it off and just say, oh, that's interesting. So I think that's a fundamental that I encourage people to bring forward with biodynamics. The other thing is that it sounds odd at first and beginning in some things. Like some things are just absolutely solid. Like you start talking about encouraging humus in your soil, or on-farm fertility. You can look out to that and say, there's a lower carbon footprint if you're not shipping things in, like fertility wise. Those things just make sense. And having livestock on the farm, animals and soil are so connected. You have the prairie soils, for example, and you've got the tall grass prairie, and you've got the buffalo that came through, and there was 8 foot of topsoil when the Europeans showed up. It was pretty amazing. Every ecosystem in the world has livestock. And whether it's in the bottom of the ocean, whether it's in a desert, whether it's on the prairies, the forest, there's always livestock. And so those types of concepts are fundamental to biodynamic, and they're easy to accept, with from most any perspective. When you start getting into the preparations or some of the foundations of biodynamic, then that's where you start getting into like, well, what's going on with that? But that's where, if you just kind of put disbelief on the shelf and just like say, okay, I don't get it, but obviously there's studies that are being done in Germany, for example, 45 years of comparison between organic, biodynamic, and conventional side by side. And conventional has the lowest organic matter, poorest soil quality, higher compaction. Then you get organic and it's better. And then you go to the biodynamic side and it's just even better. So it works. There's plenty of, and it works whether or not you believe it or not. That's the beauty of it. It's just, it will work. And then the belief side, though, that's coming back to the person. It's like, you don't have to believe it. It'll work.
I love that. This has been a really exciting conversation, and it's so interesting to hear all about Rudolf Steiner and how he was such a front runner in this whole movement, seeing a farm as a cohesive organism and all of the important aspects within a farm. And yeah, it's exciting that it's been 100 years, and very happy that the certification exists. So thank you so much for joining for the podcast. This has been really great.
All right. Yeah. Thanks for having me. It's been a pleasure, and happy to share. Thank you.